Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our heat stress webinar on a chilly day, but with the forecast of a scorching summer. I'm Kimberly O'Connell. I am an executive director here at OHCOW, and I lead out the occupational illness prevention program and steering committee, along with the Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development and all our OHS system partners. And heat stress is one of our priorities with that group, along with, as you have heard in other webinars, silica, diesel exhaust, asbestos. We're looking at welding fume, allergies and irritants, and heat stress and UV solar exposure, and noise. So we are so pleased. So through that occupational illness prevention program, we collaborate with all of our system partners, and so happy today to be doing so with Workplace Safety North and CROSH, who are very integrated into that occupational illness prevention system. We have various pillars. That group is working together on building strategic partnerships. We're showcasing that today. Research and data, analysis for occupational illness and exposure reduction, providing training and education, bringing you today, developing and sharing workplace tools. We're also doing and updating regulations and enforcing updating regulations and enforcing legislation. I did want to also share that Andre will be speaking first, our own guru from OHCOW, followed by Keith Burney from Workplace Safety North and Sandra Dorman from CROSH. We are going to be recording and we are Facebook Living for our first two speakers, but for the third speaker, we will not be recording as we have some our cutting edge research here with CROSH, and they would like to save the intellectual property for their own future publication and workshopping, but we will be providing slides for posting for Sandra's presentation. We'll go ahead with Andre. Andre is an occupational hygienist with occupational health clinics for Ontario workers. He has over 15 years of experience in occupational health. He's a graduate from Laurentian University with a Bachelor of Science in Kinesiology and a Master of Human Kinetics. He started his career in ergonomics and has made the transition to occupational hygiene a few years ago. He's board certified by both the Canadian College for Certification of Professional Ergonomists and a Canadian Certified Professional Ergonomist, and by the American Board of Industrial Hygiene as a Certified Industrial Hygienist. So welcome, Andre. He's going to take over the show today, and we'll be helping moderate in the chat. So enjoy.
Thanks, Kimberly. So our title today is Hot Work Sites and Health. The risky business of working in the heat. So like Kimberly said, we have three presenters today. There's myself, Keith Burney from WSN, and Sandra Dorman from CROSH. A bit of an outline today of what I'll be talking about. Going to get into the principles of heat, how our body responds to heat and changes to temperature, working in the heat, what complications we have from heat stress. We'll go through a little bit of a heat stress evaluation and using our Humidex heat stress response plan. So the principles of heat, as we know, temperature represents an energy of a substance or an object. So it has the ability to flow to another place. So heat tends to flow from higher areas to lower areas. And what happens with that is your body tries to keep its core temperature at 35 or 37.5 plus or minus 0.5 degrees Celsius. So we have a thermal balance with our body. So basically what's happening is you have the division of temperature. You have your peripheral temperature and then your core temperature. So what happens when you gain heat or lose heat? So your body kind of responds differently to that. So if you have a heat gain that is equal to your heat loss, your core temperature will stay the same. If you have a heat gain that is higher than your heat loss, your core temperature will rise. And then if you have a heat gain that's lower than your heat loss, your core temperature will fall. So what we're looking at here is thermal regulation. Our body has, the ability of balancing heat gain with heat loss. The thing is, humans can tolerate a decline in core temperature of about 10 degrees Celsius, but only an increase of 5 degrees Celsius. So the higher you go, obviously, if you're getting up to that, it becomes dangerous. So what happens when you get hot? Obviously, your core temperature increases, and that is part of, your blood gets warmer, and then that kind of gives a signal to your brain, which is the hypothalamus in your brain. It's your heat conversion center. This basically controls everything, and you have physiological response as a result of that. So if you have a decrease in heat, you'll have vasoconstriction of your blood vessels, you'll have an increased metabolic rate, you'll start to shiver, and the hair on your skin will start to raise. This is all, things like your body's trying to respond to heat loss. So now it's trying to gain heat. And then if you have an increase in heat, you'll have vasodilation of the blood vessels, you'll have a decreased metabolic rate, you'll start to sweat, and the hair on your skin is lowered, and that's to try and increase the evaporative cooling, try and lose as much heat as possible. So essentially your body wants to be well balanced, so in homeostasis. So, you're trying to balance heat gain with heat loss. So for heat gain, these are the things that your body will do to try and gain heat. So you have resting metabolism, that's a heat gain. Your muscular activity is another heat gain. When you're eating food, you have a thermal effect of food. Your digestive system creates heat. The environment and your hormones as well. So the body has thermoregulatory mechanisms that primarily protect against overheating, and these are the four main processes. So you have radiation, conduction, convection, and evaporation. And so radiation this is just on a regular basis, not when you're not working in the heat or not sweating. Radiation is kind of your main cooling factor, we'll say, and then followed by evaporation. However, when you start exercising and working in the heat, exercise becomes, the main source of cooling. So, or not exercise, sorry, evaporation becomes your main source of cooling during exercise. So it becomes about 80% of your heat loss during exercise or heavy load. Then you're also, losing heat through convection, radiation, and conduction. So heat loss by evaporation. So this obviously provides a major defense against overheating. So the body's surface contains approximately 2 to 4 million sweat glands. And during heat stress, the glands secrete sweat. And evaporation of the sweat from the skin exerts a cooling effect. So it actually takes the heat away from the body. And then the cooled skin in turn cools the blood, and then it's diverted to your internal organs and other tissues. So what happens in high ambient temperatures? So the higher the temperature, the less cooling effect you'll have from conduction, convection, and radiation. So they actually lose their effectiveness in cooling the body. And if the ambient temperature is actually higher than the body temperature, these three processes actually cause the body to gain heat. So sweating is really the only defense when it becomes when you're working in high ambient temperatures. So evaporation is key, right? So there's three factors affecting evaporative cooling. You have surface exposure, temperature, and relative humidity of the air, and convective air currents around the body. And remember that if the convective air currents are higher than the core temperature of your body, you're actually gaining heat. So this is important as well. The relative humidity, this is good to know. It's a ratio of water and ambient air in particular temperature to the total quantity of moisture that air can contain in a percentage. So we're going to use that number later. So again, it's important to remember that sweat doesn't actually cool the skin. It's evaporation of sweat that cools the skin. So the greater the humidity in the air, the greater the risk of overheating. So when we're looking at physiological strain, the factors that determine that are air temperature and relative humidity, individual differences in body size and fatness, the state of training, the degree of acclimatization, environmental influences such as convective air currents and radiant heat, and the intensity of the activity. And obviously your clothing as well. We're going to get into that a bit later, talk about clothing factor. So you can also self-evaluate when it becomes to heat strain. This is probably something really important for workers to know. You can measure your own heartbeat. So if it's sustained, at above your 80% of your maximum heart rate. If your body temperature is 38 degrees Celsius or more, if your recovery heart rate at 1 minute is more than 120 beats per minute, if you have symptoms of sudden severe fatigue, nausea, dizziness, or lightheadedness, this is, a sign that you're in heat strain. Another risk is that, or a symptom is that you might have profuse sweating. You might have a weight loss of more than 1.5% over a shift, and you'll notice some less frequent urination. So physiological effects, just kind of an overview again here. So the blood flow as it heats compromises the blood flow to other tissues. So what's happening is, sorry, this is my next slide. They're coming up. So you'll also have a fluid loss, so through evaporative cooling and the decreased blood volume, and your core temperature will rise. So in a hot environment, your core temperature will rise. You have working muscles, that'll increase your core temperature. And this also impairs the function of the brain and causes fatigue. So there's a circulatory dilemma. So your body faces two demands when working in heat. So your muscles require oxygen through the blood. And then your blood's also diverted to the periphery to try and transport the heat for cooling, or transport heat for cooling to the skin surface. So what happens here is like your body will favor oxygen delivery to the working muscles over cooling mechanisms. So this creates a danger as your body is trying to overcome the heat. So fluid loss in the heat, obviously the more fluid you lose, the more you become dehydrated. Over an hour of moderate activity produces a sweat loss of 0.5 to 1 liter and sometimes more. So what happens with fluid loss is you have a reduced heat dissipation, you have an increased heat storage, you have an increased cardiovascular strain, and then people become fatigued and they have a decreased work capacity. So that's why we have hydration strategies. So you can actually super hydrate, they kind of call it, or hyperhydration. It's basically ingesting extra water before work in the heat and offers thermoregulatory protection. So the strategy is simple. It's, you want to prepare for it if you know you're going to be working in the heat. So you'll be drinking 500 milliliters of water or any fluid really the night before working in the heat. Non-caffeinated fluid, sorry, not any fluid. Another 500 milliliters upon awakening, an additional 400 to 600 milliliters 20 minutes prior to activity, and consistent fluid intake throughout the day. So initially you want to have a fluid balance. So you want to make sure that your intake is equal to your fluid loss, just to stay hydrated. So signs that you're hydrated. So if you're inadequately hydrated, you'll see that you have frequent or infrequent urination. You'll have an excessive weight loss. You'll have a strong odor to your urine, and the urine color will be a dark yellow. And when you have adequate hydration, you'll urinate frequently. Your urine will be colorless and odorless. So electrolyte solutions are always good as well. They actually promote a more complete recovery during rehydration. They'll actually decrease your urinary output. They'll stimulate a thirst mechanism and restore plasma volume more rapidly. So by actually hydrating yourself, and your body will actually keep that hydration a little bit more by having the electrolytes, the electrolyte solution, sorry. So heat acclimatization, this is an important factor as well. So your body will adapt to hot environments over time in several ways. So this will include, improved cutaneous blood flow, effective distribution of cardiac output, Lower threshold and increased sweating. It's more effective distribution of sweat over the skin. It'll lower the salt content of your sweat, and it'll lower the heart rate for similar activity levels. So it takes a bit of time to become acclimatized. It can take 4 to 7 days to fully acclimatize. This is according to the ACGIH. And they suggest at least 2 hours of heat stress exposure for 5 of the last 7 days, or 10 of the last 14 days to be fully acclimatized. The problem with working in the north here is that, you know, we don't always, especially working outdoors. For outdoor work, it's difficult to become acclimatized because the weather changes from day to day. You might have a one hot day or 2, 3 hot days out of 7, so it's difficult to have a full acclimatization. However, if you're working inside, like in an industry where there's a furnace, or in the mines where, you know, you're deep, it's always the same environment, you can really fully acclimatize. You should also note that there's a noticeable decline after 4 days, and it can be completely lost or removal from the heat for 2 to 3 weeks, for approximately 2 to 3 weeks. So there's a need to reacclimatize following any lengthy vacations. So the rule of thumb is basically if you're on vacation for 2 weeks and you return to a hot environment at work, you should really take the steps to reacclimatize. So people at higher risk. So there's a lot of factors that place people at a higher risk. Everybody's different. Lack of physical activity, poor physical conditions, people who are overweight. Age has a factor if you're older or very young. Very small body size, dehydration, excessive clothing, high alcohol, caffeine, or nicotine intake as well. These are all factors that create higher risk. Occupations that are at risk, any occupation involving high air temperature, radiant heat sources, high humidity, or strenuous physical activities. So construction workers, iron and steel foundries, underground workers, ceramic plants, brick firing, firefighters, bakeries, smelter workers. These are all examples of occupations that are at risk. So what happens when your body is trying to cope with this heat? So if it becomes unable to cope with heat, we have heat illness. So we have heat rashes, heat cramps, heat exhaustion, and heat stroke. A little bit of statistics. So heat waves claim more lives each year than all other heat-related exposures combined. So hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, earthquakes. And according to the CDC, between 1979 and 2003, there was over 8,000 deaths attributed to excessive heat exposure. So that's approximately 334 deaths per year. And that number is actually increasing. So we'll go through each illness. So this is just an image of a heat rash, or they also call this prickly heat. So it's an irritation of the skin caused by excessive heat and sweating. So the rash develops as a result of the plug sweat glands, and it's usually enhanced by a hot and humid environment. So it'll be red and bumpy rash, and it'll be severely itchy. So the treatment for that is just to change into dry clothes and avoid hot environments. Rinse your skin with cool water just to try and unplug the sweat glands. So we also have heat syncope. This usually occurs in unacclimatized, dehydrated workers during the first heat wave. It's an early warning sign as well for excessive heat strain. It's not as serious as heat exhaustion. So the symptoms include you'll have maybe a short-term fainting, some dizziness. Most people, it's more lightheadedness from standing too long or suddenly rising from a sitting or lying position. You might get that initially when you start working in the heat, and it's usually a sign of dehydration as well. So the treatment for this is just to sit or lie down in a cool place doesn't have to be a long period of time. Slowly drink some water, clear juices, or a sports drink. Just rehydrate yourself. Heat cramps, they occur during or after physical activity in hot environments. It's usually in specific exercising muscles. So normally your core temperature will stay the same. You might have some heavy perspiration. The muscle cramps are in the muscle that is being exercised, so either the legs, arms, abdomen. You might feel weak or lightheaded. It's typically caused by an imbalance of fluid levels in your body. and electrolyte concentrations. And they can also be a symptom of heat exhaustion. So to prevent heat cramps, it's good to have rest. Drinking electrolyte containing drinks instead of just water, it'll increase the sodium in your blood, which, you know, when you have low blood sodium, it tends to create heat cramps or more cramping. And if they persist, just seek medical help. It's important to keep that in mind. So heat exhaustion, this usually develops in unacclimatized workers as well during the first heat waves. It's caused by a loss of large amounts of fluids and electrolytes and ineffective circulatory adjustment. So the warning signs of heat exhaustions, you'll have heavy sweating, paleness, muscle cramping, tiredness, dizziness, headaches. You'll be very thirsty, might have some nausea or vomiting, and you can faint as well. So it's similar to heat syncope, only it's a little bit more severe. Heat exhaustion is usually you're kind of getting up on the level of heat strain, where heat syncope is a little lesser. It's more of a a sudden faint. So the treatment for heat exhaustion is to move to a cool area, loosen your clothing, make the person lie down, offer small sips of cool water. It takes at least 30 minutes to cool the body down after overheating. So it's important to stay in that area for at least 30 minutes. If you're still having issues, get medical attention. And in case of cardiac arrest, it's important to have somebody close that knows CPR. So heat stroke, this is the most important and complex of the heat stress illnesses. It reflects failure of heat regulating mechanisms from an excessive high core temperature. So in classic form, your core temperature will be above 40 degrees Celsius. What happens is you start sweating, and then you have an absence of sweating, and you'll have an altered mental alertness. People will feel confused. They might not know where they are. There's two different types of heat stroke. You have exertional heat stroke, which usually occurs in workers or people who engage in strenuous physical activity for a prolonged period of time in a hot and humid environment. And they often have impeded heat dissipation. So they might be wearing some heavier clothing. There's also non-exertional heat stroke. So this is, most commonly affects sedentary and elderly individuals, persons who are chronically ill, or very young people. So this also usually occurs in environmental heat waves, and more common in areas that have not experienced a heat wave in many years. So, and it's usually for a longer term heat wave. Sometimes you'll hear that, on the news, where you have an area that's been severely hot and affected. They've had, a 1 or 2 week heat wave, and all of a sudden we have all these deaths from heat stroke, and it's usually more sedentary and elderly individuals. So in the case of occupational health, you're usually looking at exertional heat stroke. So what's the progression of heat stroke? So your body is no longer able to cool itself. So basic heat loss mechanisms are no longer functioning. So your temperature can be as high as 40 degrees Celsius. It'll start with excessive sweating, and it'll move to no sweating. You'll have hot, dry skin, headaches, dizziness, and nausea. Might have a rapid heartbeat, rapid and shallow breathing. The person will be confused or irritable. They can lose consciousness. It can lead to seizures and even to death. So it's important to try and prevent this as much as possible. If it does happen, the treatment for it is call 911 immediately. This is an urgent matter. Immediate and aggressive cooling, so either fanning, removing their clothes, spraying them with cool water, just anything to do to try and cool them as much as you can. Do not encourage eating. Most people who eat in this situation will vomit, they'll throw it up. So just small amounts of fluid. And have the victim lie down with their feet elevated and apply cold compresses. So now we're going to get into heat stress management a little bit. We'll talk about the ACGIH. This is the most common heat stress management tool, and then we'll get into the OHCOW Humidex response plan. So the ACGIH has a TLV, so this applies to nearly all heat acclimatized, adequately hydrated, unmedicated, healthy workers who are repeatedly exposed without adverse health effects. So it's based on preventing workers' core temperature from rising above 38 degrees Celsius, and it's developed for assessing heat stress based on a wet bulb globe temperature threshold. So the thing with the ACGIH, it also has a metabolic rate to it, but it's there to try and protect everybody. But the main people that they have in terms of measuring metabolic rate is they used, pretty healthy, or very healthy, I should say. Most of it's a military person that's between 150 to 160 pounds. This isn't always the case for people, so there are a lot of limitations with this. So what is WBGT? So the WBGT is a measure of the environmental contributions to heat stress. So this includes air temperature, radiant heat, and humidity. There's two ways to calculate it. You have a calculation with solar load, which will include the globe temperature, or without solar load. Dry bulb, sorry. So here are the action limits and TLV for heat stress exposure with the ACGIH. You'll see that it's a work-rest ratio. So depending on the WBGT that you get or your measured WBGT, you would implement a work-rest ratio based on that. So when we're evaluating it, you want to evaluate, assess, measure, and control, and then reevaluate your heat stress to make sure that you're having a low risk, or that you're implementing the proper controls. So this is basically the same thing. It's the existing approach to managing heat stress in workers. So if you're looking at this, I just got a blank here for sorry. So looking at this graph here, we're seeing that you're going to measure the environment, look at the clothing factor and the metabolic rate. Then it's going to determine your level of heat stress. So then it's going to say, okay, are you within that TLV? If you are, then you're going to go at a low risk. You can continue your work. If you're at a high risk, then you're going to implement a work rest cycle. And that's basically how the ACGIH works. If you look at the graph on the side with your metabolic rate and WBGT, so that's kind of your measurement based on your metabolic rate. So you're at a moderate workload, it's 32 or 33 degrees WBGT, you're in a high risk zone. So you would implement a work rest cycle. So now we get into the Humidex heat stress response plan. So this is actually based on the ACGIH TLV, where the WBGT were translated into Humidex. So we have two levels of Humidex, or two sections. So you have Humidex 1, which is based on your moderate workload for unacclimatized workers. And you have Humidex 2, which is based on the moderate workloads for acclimatized workers. So what is a Humidex? This is a Canadian invention to combine temperature and relative humidity into single numbers so people can tell you how hot it feels. So for example, if it's 26 degrees and with a 60% relative humidity, it feels like 32 degrees Celsius. So we hear this on the news and on the weather network all the time. So how do we measure Humidex? So it's measured with the natural wet bulb and the dry bulb. So if you have these thermometers, that's the most accurate way. And then it's just converted, those readings are converted into relative humidity. And we have an OHCOW Humidex calculator that you can take those readings and put them in the calculator. It'll give you your Humidex. It's on our website if you'd want to take a look at it. The other way is to buy a hygrometer. They're pretty cheap. You can get them at the hardware store for $20 to $30, and they'll give you the relative humidity and the temperature. So you can take these numbers and place them in the Humidex heat stress response plan. So if we have our hygrometer in our specific workplace, so we're not going to measure this. We're not just going to take the environment temperature or whatever weather network tells us. We are going to measure it ourselves where the activity is being done. So if it's 29 degrees Celsius and you have a relative humidity of 65 degrees or percent, it'll bring you to this table here at 38 degrees Celsius for Humidex. So if you're unacclimatized and you look at your form here, 38 degrees Celsius will give you a work rest ratio of 15 minutes rest per hour. And then if you're acclimatized, you can work as normal, just be alert for symptoms and provide extra water. So here's what the response would be. You can go through this yourself for Humidex 1 and Humidex 2. Just an example, we'll say if, again, we're at 38, so you have a 15-minute relief per hour, provide adequate cool water, at least 1 cup for every 20 minutes, and monitor worker symptoms. And if they do have symptoms, seek medical attention. So these are just, it's a basic response plan that you can use for yourself that'll pretty well cover everybody. So there are adjustments for clothing. So this is what we were talking about earlier that I mentioned that clothing can have a factor on heat. So it can limit sweat evaporation, which causes the body to heat up. Results from less airflow between the clothing and the skin, making sweat difficult or sweat evaporation difficult. The TLV the ACGIH TLV is based on wearing long sleeve cotton shirt and pants, and clothing obviously hinders evaporation, and when it does hinder it, the value is increased. So we get into the clothing adjustment factors here. So what's the current factor is the first one here. The first row or the first column is what we have been using. There is a notice of intended change in 2022, which is in the new ACGIH book. So now they've added short sleeve pants and short sleeve shirts and pants of woven material. So, cotton material or anything like that. And that gives you a -1 to the WBGT. And they've also added a factor for the limited use vapor barrier coveralls. So now there's the limited use vapor barrier coveralls with a hood. If you're covering your full head and neck and not the face, you would add +1 to the 11 that is already there. And then the clothing adjustment factors for the Humidex response plan is basically the same. It's just, these numbers have been put into our heat stress or the Humidex calculator from WBGT to Humidex. So it would give you, for double layer clothing, you'd have an increase of 5 degrees Celsius. For polypropylene coveralls, you'd have an increase of 1, and for polyolefin coveralls, you'd have an increase of 2. And then for anything above that, you would want to monitor vital signs. The more that you add, the more clothing you add, and the more you're limiting evaporative cooling, the more you want to keep an eye on that and monitor vital signs. So protective face masks and thermoregulation. It does have a negative impact on respiratory and dermal mechanisms of human thermoregulatory, in case it does impair convection, evaporation, and radiation processes. However, for the ACGIH, Fletcher et al., they look directly at the clothing adjustment factor for full face negative pressure respirators while wearing a vapor barrier ensemble with a hood. So that's while wearing, like we mentioned here, limited use vapor barrier with a coverall with a hood. So you're adding one. And they didn't find a significant difference. So for that reason, they gave face coverings a CAV of 0. The other thing here is we have adjustments for radiant heat. So this is for the Humidex. So if you're working outdoors in direct sunlight between 10 and 4 p.m., you want to add 2 to 3 degrees Celsius to the Humidex. And if you're working indoors with a radiant heat source, it's pretty well the same. If it compares to the sun, again, you'd want to add the 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. If it's less than that, you can kind of, you can play a little bit with the Humidex based on that. If it feels as hot as the sun, you would add the same amount. If it doesn't feel like that same environment, you wouldn't add anything, or you'd maybe add 1 degree Celsius to it. So it's a tool that you can kind of, it's a bit more flexible. So in summary, it's important to have a heat stress plan in place when you're working in the heat. And once a risk assessment is complete, controls should be in place to prevent heat-related illness. So I'm going to pass you to Keith now, who's going to be talking about controls. So I'm going to stop sharing here.
And Andre, just while you do that and pass it to Keith, there was a couple of just, I know we said we saved for panel, but they're quick ones on talking about the frequent urination. So the just the dichotomy, I guess, a little bit of one comment about frequent urination also being a sign of diabetes. And then one mentioning that it's a bit of a counterintuitive when you've got frequent urination being a sign of good temperature control. It's actually a sign of hydration, not necessarily temperature control. And then the other point mentioning that electrolytes assist in decreasing urination. So I just don't know if you wanted to chat to that. And Sandra's may actually talk a bit more about this as well. So we can defer should you wish or get input from everybody. I just want to throw it out there while Keith was getting his presentation up.
Sandra, you might be talking a bit about that in yours. I don't know if you want to speak to that or not.
Oh, she might not be there yet.
Okay, so
I'm just I mean I agree on the points. If you're well hydrated, you should be urinating more frequently. You want to be balancing your electrolytes. Depending on the balance of electrolytes, though, you may also be urinating more frequently because of that, because you've got to also keep your sodium levels normal, right? And I mean the comorbidity piece. Ideally would, I mean, if you're urinating more frequently because of diabetes, I think that's going to create its own rapid illness effect that will need management, but will certainly need awareness as an extra risk coming back to work, managing that disease, right? I don't know if that
That's great. Yeah, that's
yeah,
great. I just want I was buying a little time, getting a little answer in, shaking it up, getting some interaction. So I'll hand it back to you, Andre.